Hey guys, it's Danny. Welcome to another episode from our Orchid Care for Beginners series. Today, it's a special episode. I'm gonna tell you a few tips on how to ship orchids. Let's say you're at an orchid show which is not in your city. Or maybe you want to send some orchids to a loved one, or sell them, or maybe you have to move out. Well, today I'm going to give you some tips that hopefully will make sure that the orchids will arrive to the final destination in one piece, and not only perfectly fine. Since along these almost 10 years, I did a lot of ordering, and also I moved countries, so I did ship orchids from one country to the other. I kind of learned a thing or two, which I'm going to share with you today. Today's episode, together with this entire care series, is of course sponsored by rePotme.com, who offers you everything you could possibly need to properly take care of your orchid. From potting mixes to pots, fertilizers, accessories, they have it all. But not only for orchids, but also other houseplants as well. So I'll link you to their website down below. Feel free to check them out at any time, and I'll also mention the products that I personally really like and I always use. Check those ones out as well. And with that said, let us start. I have a list. I always have a list. Not sure if there's any rhyme or reason here, but let's just start. By the way, a thing that I wanted to add before we start, I'm not going to show you how to actually wrap orchids. There is no right way to do that. I'm rather going to give you the tips that are actually more important than wrapping the orchids. But if you want to see some examples of how other sellers wrap their orchids, the best thing to do is to type in the search bar, MissOrchidGirl unboxing. And I have tens of unboxings. And you will see each individual seller has a little bit of a different technique of folding that paper around the orchid. So take some inspiration from there. I don't have a technique per se, so I'm not going to show you that, but I'm going to give you the other details associated with transporting orchids. All right, rule number 1, and this is a rule, not a tip. Never, ever pack orchids wet. So if you're thinking you're just gonna mist the leaves a little bit to keep the orchids fresh, do not do that. Orchids should be shipped dry. The reason is that water will get trapped in there. So what it will do is collect pathogens like molds and bacteria, which will end up very likely affecting the orchid. And depending on the amount of time, you can end up at your destination with a fully rotten plant. It is most important to ship orchids dry on their foliage and structures like pseudobulbs, not necessarily roots, because these structures are not in charge of absorbing water. You might think they will and the orchid will be fresh at the destination, but no, it's not gonna happen. I had countless instances in which I ordered plants, they were packed wet, the paper was all moldy, the leaves were all rotten, yellow, fallen off. I'm not even gonna go into the details. I'll try to find some footage of my previous orders. Just trust me on this one. Never, ever pack orchids wet. If you're a little afraid they might have a little condensation before you pack them in the box, put them in front of a fan, or if you have a very windy location like a porch, put them there for an hour to make sure they're perfectly dry, and then pack them and send them. And that is the single rule of this entire video, and the best tip that I can give you. Always pack them dry. Tip number 2, I would be tempted to make this a rule as well, but I have seen cases where it kind of worked out due to luck. Never ever pack orchids entirely in plastic bags. So never do this business. I don't know if she's gonna fit, but let's just demonstrate. There we go, and then tie the bag. Never do that. We're coming back to rule number 1. Inside this bag, the orchid will breathe. Together with breathing and gas exchange, water is released as well. So what we're gonna have here is a bag of condensation. Condensation is water. If it gets on the leaves and in the structures, it's exactly like packing orchids wet. It will attract pathogens, molds, bacteria. You're gonna have all sorts of issues on the leaves. Do not seal them in bags like this. You don't necessarily have to seal them. Even if they're in bags opened like this, there is still the danger that some condensation will happen in the bag, and it will end up forming droplets of water in the crowns, on the leaves, and in the structures you really want to keep dry. Some parts of the orchids can be packed in bags, but we'll get to that, don't worry. The best material in my experience and the easiest one to use with orchids is paper. Whether we're talking about gift paper or that recycled brown paper, packing paper I think it is, or kitchen towels. Anything breathable will be just fine. I did have a lot of orchids in orders arriving in paper that is clipped at the top, quote unquote sealed. That is perfectly fine as well because paper breathes. So whatever tiny bit of moisture the orchids will release through breathing, it will just go out into the other pieces of paper in the box. And it's just not going to be enough to create a lot of moisture in the paper. A little bit of it might actually make it in the air. It might evaporate through the cardboard box. It's just not enough as droplets on the leaves. So whenever packing orchids, always stay with paper, whatever type of breathable paper you have. Mind you, there are some papers which are lined with a layer of plastic of sorts. Those are not good. Whatever is plasticky will not breathe. So be very mindful of the type of paper you're using. If you're not sure, kitchen towels. I've had so many orchids wrapped in kitchen towels, and not only do they breathe, but they're also very soft. So they act as a cushion, also as an insulator for the orchid. They are great. Next tip. At all costs, please do try to avoid shipping orchids in winter. If you have a choice, just don't ship them all together if it's very cold outside. If you have no choice, I'm gonna tell you about a few tricks, but if you do have a choice, just wait for spring, even summer. The vast majority of orchids we grow in our homes are exotic. They handle heat actually better than cold. There are some exceptions, of course, but I'm talking about the general orchids here, like dendrobiums, phalaenopsis, cattleyas, oncidiums, most oncidiums anyway. Orchids are more likely to handle warmth and even heat better than cold. If the temperature outside goes below 15 degrees Celsius, I'll put the equivalent in Fahrenheit on the screen. I'm not good at converting on the spot. If it's below that, it gets very tricky because we are going to run into cold damage. Most of these orchids are really not adapted to handle those temperatures. Again, there are exceptions and you can put in the extra work to research the orchid you have, but if you're dealing with a flower shop phalaenopsis, don't ship it if temperatures go below 15 degrees Celsius. You can get a lot of leaf damage. Phals are really susceptible to cold damage. Just try to avoid it altogether, but if you don't have any choice, try to make sure that your box is insulated as much as possible, and also try to obtain a heat pack. The problem with heat packs is that they only last for 72 hours or something like that. So if your shipment takes more than that, then heat packs might not do so much. But if you're shipping orchids in the same country, then maybe it's gonna be worth it to invest into a heat pack, which will make sure the orchids stay a little bit more warm than they should. You might think that postal services keep their parcels in heated rooms. I would disagree. Or if they're heated enough not to freeze, but you don't need to freeze orchids in order to damage them. They just need to experience kind of low temperatures. So be mindful of that and be careful with winter time. Summertime, it's more acceptable. I've had far less issues in the summer than in the winter, so do keep that in mind. All right, next tip. If the potting medium is still damp and you have no choice, you have to ship them right then and there. What you can actually do, where's my bag? There we go. We can cover the root system in the pot in a plastic bag, and that will actually be a good idea. So what I like to do, and I've tested this quite a few times, is put the bag around the root system in the pot and then seal the top like so. So pretty much you will have the bag making a barrier between the wet pot and the foliage and the crowns and all of these structures. Roots can be wet on transport. It's not ideal. Orchids are better shipped completely dry, but they're much better at handling wetness. Also, keep in mind, make sure that there is no leaf trapped like I have here. Wasn't paying attention. Make sure all of the leaves are outside of the bag. So in this way, we create a barrier between the water that can evaporate and create condensation and the foliage. The foliage is the one susceptible to infections and all sorts of issues. The roots, not so much. They will eventually suffocate as well, but in my experience, they do last a lot more without the amount of oxygen that leaves need. So totally, this is safe to do, and you should do it if you know the pot is wet, because what we want to do is not get the rest of the paper wet. So you can put some Scotch tape on this or tie it or make sure it stays exactly like this. And now we can go ahead and wrap our orchid into paper and the paper will not get wet. So this is one way to go about it if the pot is wet. Also, if you have a bare rooted orchid, again, I would put the roots in a bag like this. I think this is a separate point in my list, so we're gonna get to bare rooted orchids, don't worry. But yeah, the only instance I would use a plastic bag with orchids in shipment is this, nothing else. Next up, don't ship plants with signs of disease. So if you have an orchid with a spot on the leaf that looks like it's advancing, it looks pretty suspicious, cut away that spot. Do not pack the orchid together with that because that might be an active infection. And in that closed environment, that infection will only get worse. Furthermore, it can spread to the other orchids you might have in the same package. So if you have a rotten pseudobulb, remove that pseudobulb. If you have a patch on the leaf which is active infection, remove it. Remove the leaf altogether if you have no choice. Do not pack it and put it in a shipment which will inevitably a little bit more moist than the ambiental air because you can end up with an entirely affected orchid. Needless to say, if you're selling the orchid or shipping it to a customer, you should make sure that the orchid is in good condition and does not have disease. Disease happens, it's nothing to be ashamed about. Sometimes leaves get infected with stuff. Just cut away that infection. I have a video in which I explain how to do that if you're interested. I'll put it down below. Just don't ship it with an active infection. Next up, don't bend rigid plants. And this is especially valid for vandas and phalaenopsis, monopodial orchids generally. Don't try to put those leaves up. Sometimes you will order orchids from nurseries. They will come packed really, really nicely with all of their leaves up, very tidy. Don't try to recreate it if it's not possible. In nurseries, phalaenopsis orchids are grown until they're being sold in tall containers which maintain their leaves up. Once you grow them in your home, the leaves might start to lean to one side, become rigid, and if you try to bend them up, you are going to break them. So if orchids are simply too rigid to shape into whatever shape you find more comfortable, find a different solution. I always keep phalaenopsis like this and like pack them with the paper like on the sides. Let me try to show you. I would do something like this and then I will roll the paper and come back with the paper on this side. You know, something like this or like this and then go on the top. I'm not going to try and bend these leaves upwards because it's impossible. Same with the vandas. Don't try to fold their leaves, no matter how you've received orchids in the past. What you can do, and this is another tip, is tidy the plant as much as possible if it is possible. So I just posted a video on this, especially with sympodials. You might have growths that are just growing horizontally. When they're mature, they are pretty bendy, so you can actually stake them to make them a little bit more upright, and that is a good thing to do with shipping as well. Wherever possible, try to bring the pseudobulbs together and make orchids a little bit tidier. They will take up less space in the box, yes, but also they will not interfere with the other orchids and poke them on transport. You get the picture. Wherever possible, you can tidy them up like this, but again, do not force the pseudobulbs and the structures. If they're rigid and if they don't want to come closer together, don't insist. But if you see it's absolutely possible without breakage, do so. It will also take less packing material as well, and everything will just be a little bit more compact, and that's what you want with shipping orchids. Next tip, if you have to ship both some heavy products and orchids, do not put them in the same box. Now, you might say, well, I can put the heavy products like some bottles of fertilizers or a big log, a big mount. I can put it on the bottom and then on the top the orchids, and it's okay. I will mention on the box this way up and everything will be fine. Well, I have doubts. Doubts are present. Now, I'm not saying that the shipping companies do a bad job. I'm just saying some people working for the shipping companies do not care what you write on the box. And it happened to be, again, a million times. A box that clearly said, this way up, the person was storing it completely upside down in the postal office. So, heavy objects can actually squish and break orchids, particularly if you're shipping them with a flower and you want to preserve that flower spike. These flowers can be rather delicate, and if something heavy presses on it, it's gonna be mush. And it's not only that, in the handling process, trust me, that box will be turned in directions you cannot even imagine. It will be thrown. It will be put on its side. Stuff will be put on it. Then it's gonna be rotated and flipped in the air. So don't think that the shipping companies will take care. It will only stay this way. It's just not gonna happen. Not everybody has good work ethic, sadly. So make sure that you pack heavy stuff separately in a different box, not in the same box. And make like a shipment with 2 boxes united or together. Keep the orchids separate. If you're shipping tiny little stuff, that's fine, but heavy bottles, do not put them together with the orchids. You might actually break a lot of foliage and flowers, and if you're shipping orchids bare-rooted, you might even break roots, so do not mix the two. Next tip, always fill the empty spaces in the box. So let's say you only want to ship 1 or 2 orchids, but the box is slightly larger, so you have a lot of space around the orchid. Absolutely, you need to fill that space with paper, which is the best material, but other things can work as well. You can actually use those plasticky bubble things. I prefer paper, it's up to you though. And just try to fill all of these spaces around the orchid. Just showing you as a little example here, because what this will do is keep the orchids in place. Again, as I was saying, the package will be turned in ways you cannot imagine possible. So what we want is the orchid to stay put, not jiggle in the box and do all sorts of movements that can break its structures. So the more paper we can fill the box with, the more stable the orchids will be, and that will make a difference, particularly if it is in bloom, but also foliage-wise. The better we can wrap the orchid, the better it will be preserved as well, but it is important to completely fill all the empty spaces. I'm a little conflicted with this one. My personal advice would be not to ship orchids bare-rooted, but if you really have to, it's fine, it can work out. However, you have to be aware that the roots might actually end up completely crisp and dry at their destination. You might end up with very stressed roots which will just die away in their new medium, particularly if you have a sensitive rooted orchid, such as a Cattleya. Phalaenopsis tend to fare a lot better bare-rooted, but Cattleyas, oh boy, not a fun time. One thing that can keep the roots a little bit more hydrated on transport and not crisp is to bag them. If you can bag the roots, that is great. You can even pack the roots a little bit damp, but just make sure that dampness doesn't drip on the foliage. And if you really tie the bag or put some Scotch tape on it, that's enough. That's typically a good enough job not to have water on the leaves. But the problem is, after a few days, many of the roots will simply not be happy bare-rooted. If you can avoid shipping bare-root, that's great. If they have been grown mounted, they will fare better, but if they're not adapted to being bare-rooted generally, so if they're unpotted, it's done, it's game over. I would not ship Cattleyas bare-rooted unless they have been grown bare-rooted. So that's how I stand on bare-rootedness. And lastly, check the various transport options you have at your disposal. Yes, postal services might be cheaper, but they might take a lot of time, and maybe that difference in cost might be justified if you go to a courier service that has maybe a good offer, maybe some good rates, something of the sorts. If you're paying $20 more for super fast shipping, I would take it. Just because it happened so many times for me to have somewhere in a country for weeks and weeks and weeks, and that's not good. I do actually have some videos about orchids spending 3 months on transport, and they were shipped from the European Union, which is where I live. They should have arrived fast with postal services. They did not. It is what it is. You cannot really trust the standard postal service to arrive in specific days. So just check to see what other offers and prices you have available. They might be worth it. Maybe they won't be worth it, but at least you tried. And of course, if you're traveling by plane or by car and you have to take orchids with you, maybe they can fit in a separate luggage. That's always better to do because you have at least some control over that package, right? But if you have no choice, then weigh your options and get as many offers as possible. Righty, so with that said, these have been the tips for shipping orchids, which I know I promised for a long time. Here we go, finally did them. Hope this will be helpful to you. Let me know if you have some other tips that I didn't mention or maybe I don't know of. Put them in the comments below so we all can learn. And with that said, thank you so much for watching. Thank you rePotme for sponsoring yet another beginner video. Check out my second channel for aquarium videos and maybe other plants as well. And with all of that said, I'll see you all next time. Bye!